My life was a carefully constructed facade. On the surface, I was the model of a devoted husband and father. Laura, my wife, and I had been married for 15 years, and our two children, Emily and Jacob, were the center of my universe. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. Beneath the surface, however, there was a part of me I had buried deep, a part that craved something I could never admit aloud. I thought I had silenced those desires until that fateful night when my carefully balanced world began to crack. It started with a call to a bar. A fight had broken out, and as a cop, it was my job to restore order. The scene was the usual chaos: broken bottles, drunken shouting, and two men locked in a brawl. As I moved to break it up, my eyes fell on one of the fighters. A young man, barely in his 20s, with tousled blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and a physique that seemed crafted from marble. He was breathtaking, even in the middle of the commotion. When I grabbed his arm to pull him away, he stumbled into me, his chest brushing against mine. "Easy there," I muttered, my voice steady despite the jolt of electricity that shot through me. His lips were swollen from the fight, and he had a faint smirk, as though he found the whole situation amusing. "You're under arrest," I added, trying to focus on my duty. But my heart was pounding in a way it hadn't in years. In the squad car, the tension was palpable. He slumped in the passenger seat, his head resting against the window, but every so often, he'd glance at me with those eyes that seemed to see right through me. "What's your name, officer?" he asked, his voice soft but teasing. "James," I replied curtly, keeping my focus on the road. "And yours?" He hesitated before answering. "Ryan." The name suited him, simple yet striking. As I pulled up to his address, he lingered, one hand on the car door. "Thanks for not throwing me in a cell tonight," he said, his voice low and almost suggestive. Before stepping out, he added with a grin, "You're pretty easy on the eyes, Officer James." My stomach flipped, and I felt my face heat. I didn't respond, but his words stayed with me long after I drove away. That night, I couldn't sleep. Ryan's face, his voice, his smile, they were imprinted in my mind. For years, I had fought these feelings, convincing myself they were nothing more than fleeting thoughts. But Ryan had reignited something in me, something I wasn't sure I could control. The following morning, I woke up feeling restless. Laura was in the kitchen, humming a tune as she packed lunches for the kids. She looked up with a smile when I entered, but I could barely meet her eyes. Guilt gnawed at me, though I hadn't technically done anything wrong. Yet. I grabbed my coffee and left the house, telling myself I just needed some air. But instead of heading to the station, I found myself parked outside Ryan's apartment. He was sitting on the front steps, a cup of coffee in hand, wearing a casual hoodie and sweatpants that only seemed to accentuate his athletic build. When he noticed me, a slow smile spread across his face. "Couldn't stay away, huh?" he teased, standing and walking over to my car. I rolled down the window, trying to appear composed. "Just checking in," I said. "Wanted to make sure you're staying out of trouble." Ryan laughed, a sound that was both genuine and playful. "You're either a very dedicated cop or something else," he said, leaning against the car door. His confidence was disarming, and before I could second-guess myself, I accepted his invitation to come inside. His apartment was modest but welcoming, filled with little details that hinted at his personality. A guitar propped in the corner, books scattered on the coffee table, and a faint scent of sandalwood in the air. We talked for hours, the conversation flowing effortlessly. Ryan was smart, funny, and unfiltered in a way that was refreshing. He asked about my life, my family, my job, and while I answered truthfully, I left out the parts that mattered most, like why I couldn't stop thinking about him. When I finally stood to leave, he walked me to the door, his expression shifting from playful to serious. "James," he said quietly, his hand brushing mine, "I think you feel it too." Before I could respond, he leaned in and kissed me. It was soft and hesitant, as though he was testing the waters. And for a brief moment, I let myself fall into it. But then reality crashed back, and I pulled away. "I can't," I murmured, my voice hoarse. He didn't argue, just nodded, his gaze holding mine with an intensity that made my chest ache. As I walked away, I knew I was crossing into dangerous territory, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. The days that followed were a blur of routine and distraction. At home, Laura continued to play the role of the perfect wife, but I could sense her noticing my growing distance. I avoided her questions, buried myself in work, and tried to convince myself that the kiss with Ryan was a momentary lapse. Yet, no matter how much I tried, my mind kept drifting back to him. His voice, his touch, they haunted me. Against my better judgment, I reached out. A simple text, "Can we talk?" He replied almost immediately, and before I knew it, we were meeting at a secluded coffee shop across town. Ryan looked different out of his casual clothes, clean-cut and polished in a way that made him even more striking. When he saw me, he smiled, but there was an underlying tension in his expression. "I didn't think I'd hear from you again," he said, his tone soft but edged with curiosity. I avoided his gaze, staring into my untouched cup of coffee. Whatever this is, it can't happen," I said finally. "I have a family, a career. It's complicated." Ryan nodded, but instead of pulling back, he leaned forward. "Complicated doesn't mean impossible, James. You don't have to fight this alone." His words cut through my defenses, and I found myself opening up in ways I never had before. I told him about the part of me I had buried, the desires I had denied, and the fear that came with acknowledging them. Ryan listened without judgment, his hand briefly brushing mine in a gesture of reassurance. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen. Our connection deepened that afternoon, and by the time I left, I knew there was no turning back. We started meeting in secret. Quiet dinners, long drives, stolen moments that felt both thrilling and dangerous. Every time I was with Ryan, I felt alive in a way I never had before. But the guilt of betraying Laura weighed heavily on me. Still, I couldn't bring myself to let him go. At home, things grew more strained. Laura noticed my absences and began asking more questions. "Is everything okay?" she asked one night as we lay in bed. I nodded, avoiding her gaze. "Just work," I muttered. But the truth was far more complicated, and deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before my double life unraveled. Our secret affair continued, and with each passing week, my feelings for Ryan grew stronger. He was everything I didn't know I needed. Kind, passionate, and unafraid to show his vulnerabilities. But as much as I cherished our time together, I couldn't ignore the mounting pressure at home. Laura's suspicions were growing, and I was running out of excuses. One evening, as I sat in Ryan's apartment, he reached for my hand. "How long do you think we can keep this up?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I can't imagine walking away from you." Ryan smiled faintly, but there was a shadow in his eyes. "James, I don't want to be your secret forever. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew he deserved more than stolen moments and half-truths, but the thought of losing him terrified me. Still, I couldn't give him what he wanted, not without destroying the life I had built. The weight of my choices pressed down on me, and for the first time, I began to wonder if I could keep this balancing act going. At home, Laura's patience was wearing thin. She started watching me more closely, her questions becoming sharper and more frequent. One night, she confronted me directly. "James, what's going on?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "You've been distant, distracted. Are you seeing someone else?" My heart raced as I scrambled for an answer. "Of course not," I lied, forcing a laugh. "You're imagining things." But Laura wasn't convinced. Her intuition was sharp, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she uncovered the truth. Despite my growing fears, I couldn't bring myself to end things with Ryan. Every time I saw him, my resolve crumbled. He was my escape, my solace, and the thought of losing him was unbearable. The tension at home was suffocating. Laura wasn't one to ignore her instincts, and her probing questions were becoming harder to deflect. I found myself snapping at her over the smallest things, guilt manifesting as irritation. She watched me closely, her eyes filled with suspicion and hurt, but I couldn't bring myself to stop what I was doing. Ryan had become a part of me, a part I couldn't bear to lose. One evening, as I sat in my car outside Ryan's apartment, I stared at my phone, debating whether to text him. My heart ached with the weight of what I was doing, but the thought of seeing him, of feeling his warmth, was too powerful to resist. I typed a simple message. "I'm outside." Moments later, he appeared, his smile lighting up the dark street. "Rough day?" he asked as he slid into the passenger seat. I nodded, letting out a weary sigh. "It's getting harder," I admitted, my voice low. Ryan reached over, his hand brushing mine. "You don't have to do this alone, James," he said softly. His words were meant to comfort, but they only deepened my internal conflict. How could I share this burden when I was the one who had created it? We drove to a secluded spot by the lake, a place where we could talk without fear of being seen. Ryan leaned against the car, his gaze fixed on the shimmering water. "I don't want to pressure you," he began, his tone hesitant, "but I need to know if there's a future for us." His vulnerability was both endearing and heartbreaking. I wanted to promise him the world, but the reality of my situation was far more complicated. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "I care about you, Ryan, more than I should. But I have a family, kids who depend on me." Ryan nodded, his expression unreadable. "I get it," he said quietly. "But you can't keep living like this, James. You'll break." His words lingered in the air, a painful truth I couldn't deny. When I returned home that night, Laura was waiting for me. "You've been out a lot lately," she said, her tone deceptively casual. "Is everything okay?" I forced a smile, nodding as I kissed her on the cheek. "Just work," I replied. But as I walked away, I felt her eyes on me, filled with a mix of doubt and determination. As the weeks passed, my double life became harder to maintain. Laura's suspicions grew, and she began watching me more closely. Every time my phone buzzed, her eyes flicked to it, searching for clues. I deleted every message from Ryan, but the constant vigilance was taking its toll. At work, my colleagues noticed my distraction, and I started making small mistakes on the job. Ryan, too, was feeling the strain. "You're pulling away," he said one night as we lay tangled in each other's arms. His voice was soft, but there was an edge of hurt beneath his words. I'm trying to keep things from falling apart, I replied, my voice cracking. It's not that I don't want this. It's that I don't know how to keep it. Ryan cupped my face, forcing me to meet his gaze. You don't have to do it alone, he said, his voice firm. But you need to decide what you want, James, before it's too late. The weight of his words lingered as I returned home, only to find Laura waiting for me with a determined look on her face. We need to talk, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. My heart sank as I followed her into the living room, where she confronted me with the question I had been dreading. Are you cheating on me? She asked, her voice trembling. I hesitated, the truth clawing at my throat. No, I lied, forcing myself to meet her gaze. Laura studied me, her eyes searching for answers. I want to believe you, James, she said finally, but something doesn't feel right. Her words cut deep, and for a moment, I considered coming clean. But the thought of losing my family, my career, and everything I had built was too much to bear. That night, I barely slept. Ryan's voice echoed in my mind, urging me to make a choice. But how could I choose between the life I had always known and the person who had awakened a part of me I never knew existed? The weight of my indecision was crushing, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The tension in my life reached its boiling point one evening when I came home to find Laura unusually quiet. She barely acknowledged me, her focus entirely on her phone. Something about her demeanor made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to act normal. After dinner, she disappeared into the bedroom, and I assumed she was giving me the cold shoulder. It wasn't until later that night that I realized she had been digging for answers. I was in the shower when I heard the bathroom door open. Laura's voice cut through the sound of running water, sharp and icy. James, who's Ryan? My blood ran cold. I froze, gripping the shower wall for support, my mind racing for an explanation. Ryan? I asked, feigning ignorance. What are you talking about? Don't play dumb with me, she snapped, holding up my phone. My heart sank as I realized what had happened. An unsent message to Ryan had been left open, a careless mistake I couldn't take back. I turned off the water and stepped out, wrapping a towel around myself. Laura, it's not what you think, I started, but the look on her face stopped me cold. Her eyes were red, tears streaming down her cheeks, but her anger burned hotter than her pain. How long? She demanded, her voice breaking. How long have you been lying to me, James? I couldn't meet her gaze, the weight of my guilt suffocating. It's complicated, I muttered weakly, but she cut me off. Don't you dare say that. You've been seeing him behind my back, haven't you? I didn't answer, and my silence was confirmation enough. Laura let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. I gave you everything, James. Our family, our life together. Was it not enough? Her words sliced through me, leaving wounds I knew would never heal. I'm sorry, I whispered, but the apology felt hollow. I had betrayed her in the worst way, and there was no undoing the damage. Laura's discovery marked the beginning of the end. She didn't confront me again immediately, but instead began planning in secret. Her demeanor shifted, calm and composed on the surface, but beneath it, I could feel her seething rage. She was waiting for something, and I had no idea what it was until it was too late. Ryan and I continued to meet, though the weight of Laura's knowledge hung over me like a storm cloud. I tried to act normal, but Ryan noticed the change. "You're tense," he said one night as we sat in his apartment. "What's going on?" I hesitated, debating whether to tell him the truth. "Laura knows something," I admitted finally. "She hasn't said much, but I can feel it." Ryan frowned, concern etched into his features. "Maybe we should take a break," he suggested, "just until things cool down." The thought of not seeing him, even temporarily, was unbearable. "I can handle it," I insisted. "I just need to be more careful." Ryan didn't look convinced, but he didn't push me further. A week later, Laura told me she was taking the kids to visit her parents for the weekend. The relief was overwhelming. I thought I had more time to figure things out. That evening, I went to Ryan's apartment, thinking we were safe. We talked, laughed, and for a moment, I let myself forget about everything else. But Laura wasn't visiting her parents. She had set a trap, and I walked right into it. The door burst open, and there she stood, her face a mixture of rage and heartbreak. "So this is where you've been," she said, her voice trembling. Ryan froze, his eyes darting between us in shock. "Laura, I can explain," I started, but she cut me off. "Don't," she hissed. "I've seen enough." The confrontation was brutal, every word a dagger aimed at my heart. Laura's pain was palpable, and Ryan looked devastated, caught in the crossfire. By the time she stormed out, I knew there was no salvaging my marriage. The life I had built was crumbling, and I was powerless to stop it. In the days that followed, Laura moved out with the kids, leaving the house eerily quiet. The silence was deafening, a constant reminder of what I had lost. Ryan tried to comfort me, but I could see the guilt in his eyes. "I never wanted this to happen," he said softly one evening. "I didn't mean to ruin your life." "It's not your fault," I replied, though the words felt hollow. Deep down, I knew I had made the choices that led us here. Still, the pain of losing my family was unbearable. I loved Ryan, but the cost of our relationship was higher than I had anticipated. Laura filed for divorce, and while she didn't explicitly name Ryan as the cause, it was clear to everyone involved. My colleagues began to look at me differently, whispers following me wherever I went. The life I had worked so hard to maintain was unraveling, and I felt like a shadow of the man I once was. Ryan and I tried to make it work, but the strain was too much. He saw how broken I was, and it weighed on him. "Maybe you need time," he said one night, his voice heavy with sadness. "Time to figure out who you are without all of this hanging over you." I wanted to argue, to beg him to stay, but I knew he was right. The night we said goodbye was one of the hardest of my life. We sat together in his apartment, holding each other for what felt like hours. "I'll always love you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But you need to heal." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. As I walked out the door, I felt like I was leaving a piece of myself behind. In the months that followed, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. Laura and I worked out a custody arrangement, and while she was civil, the warmth between us was gone. My relationship with the kids became my priority, but the absence of Ryan was a constant ache in my chest. I thought about him every day, wondering if he was okay, if he had moved on. I wanted to reach out, but I held back, knowing it wouldn't be fair to either of us. The love we shared had been real, but it had come at too high a price. One evening, as I sat alone in my empty house, I received a text from Ryan. "I hope you're doing okay," it read. My heart ached at the sight of his name, but I didn't respond. I knew I couldn't give him what he deserved. and the best thing I could do for him was let him go. Life went on, but I was forever changed. I had tasted a love that was forbidden, a love that had opened my eyes to parts of myself I had kept hidden for so long. But in the end, I chose responsibility over desire, sacrificing my happiness for the sake of my family. Whether it was the right choice, I would never truly know. Leave your rating from 1 to 10 in the comments for this story. We'd love to know what you think about this emotional and intense narrative. This story is a powerful reflection on how our deepest desires can clash with the responsibilities we carry and the choices that define us. James experienced a forbidden love that made him question his identity, his family, and the true meaning of happiness. In the end, he had to let go of something that completed him, choosing what he believed was best for his family. It's a reminder that even the most passionate love isn't always enough to overcome the barriers of reality. This is a true story submitted by a follower of our page. If you have an impactful, emotional, or unforgettable story, share it in the comments. Who knows? Your story might be featured as a video here on our channel. Don't forget to leave your rating from 1 to 10 for this story. Your opinion matters. And remember, we bring you new emotional stories every day. Follow our channel so you don't miss a single one.